It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Russ Bestley from the London College of Communication, a reader in graphic design, and he's crazy. He does 100-mile runs. I've run 3 marathons in my life, which I thought was impressive, and this gentleman laughs at such things.
I don't laugh at such things.
Well, it's a genuine pleasure to have you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And for talking to us.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. I've had a little bit of a briefing about you guys, about your dissertations and your the subject areas that you're covering, ideas about sort of critical thinking and academic thinking in relation to your subject. So I'm going to start by sort of talking sort of more widely than the specifics of what my lecture's about. My lecture's about punk. It's about punk graphics in particular, graphic design, visuals, and about a sort of an ongoing passion of mine for the subject, for the subculture, for punk music, and my investigations into it. So it's different areas, different things that I look at as a kind of an academic. I've been called a design historian, although I didn't train as a design historian. I trained as a graphic designer. So I write design histories. I write about punk. I produce exhibitions about punk. I do talks about punk. But you may not be particularly interested in punk. It might be that you've got other interests in other fields of music, I would assume, because you're all here studying in a music college. But I'm hoping to make some of these ideas transferable to other areas that you might be interested in, more particularly than punk. So a little bit of background as to what I did, how I got into this. My name is Russ Bestley, or Dr. Russell Bestley. I'm now employed as a reader in graphic design, London College of Communication, part of the University of the Arts London. A reader is it's a step down from a professor. So basically I'm just employed to research, is what I do. I supervise PhD students, so I've got a few PhD students that I teach. But beyond that, and I do a few occasional lectures, but beyond that I'm just employed to learn more about something, about my subject, and to tell people about it, which is a great position to be in. In 1977, I was 15, and I discovered this thing called punk rock in the UK. I discovered it because I lived in the middle of Kent, in southeast England, and the News of the World, my mum and dad read the Sunday newspaper. It was full of shock horror stories about this terrible thing that was happening around the country, where kids are sticking safety pins through their noses and telling everyone to fuck off. And I thought, that sounds brilliant. And my parents were appalled by it, and my grandparents were appalled by it, which made it even more attractive to me as a sort of 15-year-old. So I kind of got into it, I started getting involved, started going to gigs, started collecting records, and got into a band in the late 70s that were just terrible. We were really, really awful, couldn't play a note, which didn't really matter at the time, and then kind of learned to play a little bit more than that and continue. I still play in a band today, so I kind of carried on playing music. Being involved in it, I got involved as a stage manager, as a lighting man, as a sound man, as behind the scenes as a roadie, as a humper, where you just hump the gear in and out of local venues for bands, everybody from Motorhead to the Nolans I worked for, and everything in between. Did the Clash and the Damned and the Stranglers, which was cool, but I did some pretty uncool things as well. David Essex, and eventually found my way into various jobs. And by the late 1980s, I had a family. I was living on a council estate in Hampshire, and driving a forklift truck. I was made redundant, and I decided, what can I do now? I went back to college. So in about 1991, I went back to college, and I went to study art and design. That kind of got me back into this academic mindset, academic way of thinking. I had been out of college for a long time. I hadn't been involved in academia. And I met lecturers at college who said, "Oh, you like that punk stuff, don't you? You should read this." And would read Dick Hebdige's Subcultures book, and they would give me these texts and say, "Oh, read this. This tells you about this thing that you're interested in." And I'd read them and found that they weren't really covering areas that I thought they should. I thought that, well, there's bits of my life, bits of my experience, bits of my involvement in punk that just aren't touched on in these things. So I had a kind of critical angle. That's what you guys are doing with your dissertations. You're finding a position, a critical position relative to a subject, and saying, well, actually, is that true? Isn't it true? How can I bring in other opinions into there? How can I test out things, test the validity of arguments? So you can start with a hypothesis and say, I want to try and prove or disprove this hypothesis, this idea. So that moved me into academic research, producing my own undergraduate and then postgraduate work, and then eventually a PhD. So the PhD I did started in about 2000, finished in 2007, was called Hitsville, UK, Punk and Graphic Design in the Faraway Towns, which is kind of where we come on to this talk. So I did a PhD, did a whole range of analysis of a whole body of visual material or musical material related to UK punk between 1976 and 84. And it was called Hitsville UK Punk in the Faraway Towns. It's a complicated title. It comes from a couple of punk lyrics. What I was interested in was this stylised version of history that said punk happened in London in 1976 in the King's Road. With this year we've got something called Punk London going on. I was given this leaflet by the Design Museum on Monday because they've asked me to do something for them, which is 40 years of subversive culture. And it's got your map on the back that tells you, this is where all the punk things happened in London. Now, I don't come from anywhere near there. I come from down here somewhere. And friends of mine come from up here somewhere and over there somewhere. But they were punks, and they were involved in punk, and they weren't hanging around with Billy Idol in the King's Road for 5 minutes in 1976. They were really active, producing their own music, creating their own bands, making their own artwork in South Wales or in North East England or in Scotland, or more broadly in America or in Scandinavia or in Japan. And not just in 1976, in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and now. So there's a continuum. There's a big punk underground that still exists around the world. It's still very powerful. There's a lot of people that got involved at different points in time in different places. So this, I kind of get frustrated by this way that this stereotype is. It happened. We can put it in a box and we can put it over there and put it in a museum and say it happened there at that time. These are the celebrities that were involved in it. And then they moved on to do something else and forget about the rest. That everybody else is irrelevant. Well, I'm one of those everybody else and wants to sort of put the other side of the story. So I did an exhibition. This is a catalogue for the exhibition. So I was interested in punk in the faraway towns. What it means is far away from London. There's a song by The Clash called London Calling, which says London Calling to the faraway towns. I was flipping on its head. There's another song by The Clash called Hitsville UK. So it was a flipping on its head and saying, well, what happens to the people? What was their involvement in this in the faraway towns? So there's a number of routes into this. I'm going to come on to the research in a moment. Beyond that, I did the PhD. I was commissioned in 2012 to write a book about punk posters originally. And we extended it to more about the visual language, the visual material, the graphic design. I wanted to call it the design of punk. The German book, the German edition is called Design und Punk, but the English one, they had insisted on it being called art rather than design. So I wrote a book about the kind of history of punk visuals in 2012. So it was published in France, in Germany, in the USA. Back to the PhD, I did a number of different things. I produced a timeline of 7-inch singles. Everybody know what a 7-inch single is? Hopefully, in the music college. You've got 12-inch, before downloads, we had, before CDs, we had vinyl records, and you've got vinyl albums, which are 12 inches, typically 12 inches big, in a sleeve like that, and 7-inch singles, which is typically one track on each side. They're a kind of taster. There's not much money in them from a business model, but they kind of promote albums. The thing about punk is that it's so closely tied in with the 7-inch single. Many of the bands that produced a 7-inch single, that was the only artefact they ever made, if there. So they could get two songs onto a disc, and that was the pinnacle of their success. Then they split up. There was a kind of maxim. There was this phrase that was used in the early days of punk that said anyone can do it, and I'm really interested in what happens when anyone does do it. Doesn't mean that necessarily it's good. I actually personally like the really bad stuff. I really like the really amateur. Try and have a go, and you're stretching to the peak of your ambition to be able to make a noise and put it on a disc. Those things I find really fascinating, and they do it once, and it happens once, and they sell 10 copies, and the other 500 copies go under the bed, and that's it, and they disappear. And it's kind of something that many of us have done, including myself, and I'm interested in that. So there was a mapping, there was a timeline of this that I mapped, which I haven't got here, that I'm not going to show today, and there was a number of different groupings. So this is some graphic material that kind of predates punk. So this is some R&B pub rock material, records from the mid-1970s by the likes of the Count Bishops and Dr. Feelgood, Eddie and the Hot Rods, and some comedy punk. That's another aspect that we're going to come on to. So the early days, the first kind of big wave that we're seeing celebrated in punk London, are bands like the Sex Pistols. I'm sure you've heard of the Sex Pistols, the Clash, the Damned, the kind of big names of UK punk. And these are some of their early records. I can zoom in on this, but I'll just give you an overview at the moment. This is a kind of collection of early records. The ones at the top, these are the first half dozen Sex Pistol singles. In fact, that's the second one. The first one didn't have a picture sleeve. First few Sex Pistol singles where there were classic graphic design approaches. And you may not be a graphic designer, but you probably understand some of these things. This was a song called God Save the Queen, where it was Jubilee year 1977 in the UK. There were pictures of the Queen everywhere. We were having supposedly street parties to celebrate that the Queen had been on the throne for 25 years. It was the Silver Jubilee of the Queen, and there were commemorations everywhere. There was an official photograph of the Queen by Cecil Beaton, the official photographer, royal photographer, and it was everywhere. Jamie Reid, the designer for the Sex Pistols, got that photo of the Queen and then just ripped out her eyes and her mouth and got ransom note lettering, or cut out letters out of a newspaper to say, Sex Pistols, God Save the Queen. He did a poster for that where he stuck a safety pin through her lip. He put swastikas on her eyes on another poster. So it was a real kind of, how do I take something and, engage with it and undermine it and attack it. The third single, Holidays in the Sun, which you can't really see from there. I can show you. I can leave a PDF of this for you to put online. Holidays in the Sun. Jamie Reid took a tourist brochure for holidays in Belgium. Took it, and it's about a couple travelling around having a lovely time, and he put the lyrics of the song in these speech bubbles, a little cartoon series it is, and they're saying, oh, isn't it lovely in Belgium? And now it says a cheap holiday in other people's misery. It's kind of an attack again on this kind of stereotype of the way that we live. He got sued by the travel company and had to withdraw the sleeves, and they all had to be pulped, so they had to be destroyed in front of the company solicitor. So there's all sorts of stories to these, but this is this kind of stereotype that we see all over and over again. Then punk became popular, and there was something called New Wave came out of it, so it's kind of becomes a bit glossier and a bit shinier, and better produced, musically better produced, and there's more money involved, so the production of the graphics become more sophisticated, more slick. There's Buzzcocks along the top there, great classic pop punk group. Precursors to the likes of Green Day, and sleeves designed by Malcolm Garrett. There's a lot of stories behind those, but I won't go into those. And Magazine, The Damned again, morphing into a more pop culture group, the Boomtown Rats, people like that. This is, to me, where it gets interesting. This is the kind of the reaction to that. So these are the have-a-go heroes. These are the ones that made one record. These are the ones that kind of say, well, actually, we want to get on this punk bandwagon, we want to do something. Graphically, they're quite different from that last slide. So here we have these kind of coloured, full colour or 2 or 3 colour, sophisticated pieces of design. These are kind of a bit more raw, a bit more down to earth. Well, how do we get a picture on a sleeve? We get a photograph of the band, and we just write the name of the band underneath it. So that's the kind of the second division, if you like, of this punk movement. Here we've got some DIY, so this is where people really took this idea about anyone can do it and do it yourself to another level. The first Buzzcocks EP was called Spiral Scratch. Pete Shelley, the guitarist, borrowed some money from his dad, and they made their own record. They recorded it in, I think, 2 hours in a studio and got it pressed up as an EP, and they sold out of that EP. They made enough money to fund the next one. Desperate Bicycles at the top, they made 500 copies of their first single, and they had a set of instructions about how to make a single that they told other people. The song lyrics were about how to make a record. It was called It Was Easy, It Was Cheap, Go and Do It. So they were talking about how do I make a record, how do I tell other people how to make a record. They made 500 copies, they sold all of those, and they made enough money to make 1,000 copies of their next record. They sold all of those, made 1,000 copies of the next record. They did 4 singles and 1 album in that sort of series, and then they gave up, and then they stopped. Never been issued, you can't get it on download, you can't get it on CD. They've been asked over and over again, will you reissue this? And they said no. They said we did it at the time, what would be the point? So there was a kind of idea about how empowering other people going on there. So the television personalities and Scritti Politti were 2 groups that had a set of instructions about where to get your record pressed, how much it costs to get sleeves printed. So they were taking this idea about anyone can do it and empowering people and saying, well, we're going to make a record about making a record and tell other people how to do it, which was really quite an exciting thing about something called do-it-yourself, DIY. There was a punk resurgence in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and there was a new breed of bands, mostly not from London, mostly from across the UK, from Scotland, from the northeast, northwest, southwest. These are some of their graphics, and this is just kind of overviews of things, and there were some other elements, other subgenres that came out of punk. So Oi was one, which was kind of a crossover with skinhead music. It had some racist and some anti-racist elements within it, and anarcho-punk, which I'm sure Mike Dines will talk to you about at length, which was kind of taking the idea of anarchism from the Sex Pistols' Anarchy in the UK and making it a more literal interpretation of anarchist theory. So communal living, vegetarianism, animal rights, women's rights, a whole range of kind of political attitudes embraced within a particular aspect of the subculture. And these were the graphics for that. So we're seeing that there's different graphic languages at work. So this is kind of raw, black and white, hard-hitting. The new wave stuff was quite polished and multicoloured. The DIY stuff was, well, how do I get a pen and make a record? How do I make a record sleeve with no training and no skills? Well, I get a 7-inch piece of paper and I draw on it, and then I photocopy it. That really was the level of production there. So, kind of come on to the other aspect that I wanted to explore in my research for Hitsville UK was the way that punk responded to locality. So early punk records, this is a record by The Clash called Clash City Rockers, and it talks about their fans and their fan base, and the cover, this is the record cover, has got photographs of their fans in West London, in the King's Road. So there they are, walking down the road, being obnoxious, waving at the camera, and it's about London, about their fan base in London. So that's an early Clash record. The Vibrators, London Girls, they got London in the title. So we're talking again about the city. And down here we've got a little road sign, which isn't really a road sign because it's tiny, that says King's Road, Southwest 5 or where it is. So that's telling us, locating it. Punk is in the King's Road, it's in London, this is where it is. And this is the way that the London girls, that the punk girls dress in that part of the city. Menace did a song about Greater London Council. The Greater London Council, prior to what you have now, the Lord Mayor's office, etc., was the council, the authority, local authority for London. They banned punk gigs in 1977, so Menace did a song about them called GLC, Greater London Council, which the chorus was, GLC, you're full of shit. But it was a kind of direct stack. But again, it locates it. It's London once again. So we're talking about London and interest in London. This is a group called London. They call themselves London, and so they're a punk band, and they're locating themselves. Interestingly, possibly for you guys, this guy here is a man called John Moss. He's a drummer. He became the drummer in Culture Club. So he ended up drumming with Boy George. In fact, he ended up having a relationship with Boy George. So that's his first band, his punk band that he was in. Charlie Harper, this is 1980, around Barmy London Army, another photograph of an audience in London, and we're still talking about that place. So I'm getting a little bored with London. This is a group called The Panic from Manchester, on Rainy City Records, because Manchester's known as the Rainy City, and I don't know if you can read that from over there, but it says, "We're so bored with London." So there they are, they've come from somewhere else, and they're saying, well, we're not London, we're from somewhere else, we've got our own local identity. So they start reacting against London. So The Panic did that. There's some more generic descriptions of, rather than London, about Britain. So this is red alert from the northeast of England, from Sunderland, come down to London, get the photograph taken in front of a famous landmark, and talk about life in Britain. And again, this is a band called Antisocial from Blackpool in the northwest of England, made in England, painted on the wall. So we're talking generically about sort of locality in a national sense. Sham 69, famous band, did a song called Hersham Boys. Hersham was a place in South London. That's where they got their name from. I think on the local station, the HER was crossed out, so they just had Sham, and that was the name of the band came from that locality, from that place. So here's some of their mates lined up in front of the camera. We're going to celebrate our locality. Done more generically, Leighton Buzzards. This was a bit of a comic take on a name. They came from Leighton, from the East End of London. Do you know what Leighton Buzzard? Do you know where Leighton Buzzard is?
No.
There's a place called Leighton Buzzard that's out near Milton Keynes, and it's spelled Leighton, Leighton Buzzard. And so they come from Leighton in London, so they become the Leighton Buzzards as a group. It's a nice game to play. And again, they're photographed in the High Street in Leighton. This is where we are and who we are. The Lurkers, they're photographed here out in front of a venue called the Red Cow, which was a popular punk venue in London. So what we're seeing is that the way that punk bands are trying to sort of locate themselves either nationally or locally or in relation to the subculture. So project some image of themselves. Well, this is us, this is who we are, this is where we're involved. The Lurkers again, they came from a place called Ickenham, which is out in just outside West London, outside the kind of towards Leighton really. So there we have. They were based in Fulham. Their first album was called Fulham Fallout. So there they are in a pastoral scene, pencil drawn scene out in the countryside with Ickenham one way and Fulham another way. Country sort of house in the background, farm in the background. So why am I finding this interesting? The straps came from Brixton. This is the Brixton Riots, 1981, photograph from the Brixton Riots. On the back, the ironic "Welcome to Brixton," which used to be painted on the bridge across the main road down in Brixton. That's an actual photograph of that place. I'm interested because these things are not the stereotype. I'm interested because these things are kind of telling stories about locality and place that are away from what the conventions are and what I've been told. A group called Stiff Little Fingers from Northern Ireland. This is a single called Alternative Ulster, and there they have a staged photograph. Probably a found photograph, actually, probably from, it looks to me like a Magnum photography, like an official photojournalism photograph for something like the Sunday Times or something, rather than something that's commissioned by the band. So there we have a soldier in Northern Ireland during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and a child laughing. Welsh punk. So that was Northern Ireland. This is Welsh punk. This is I don't know if anyone speaks. Does anyone speak Welsh? Eternal Cock. I can't quite pronounce it, but that's what they're called. It's a song about schoolgirls, but this is their song. That's them in the window there. This is their song. It's in the Welsh language. So again, it's not the stereotype. It's not what we expect. It's not the Sex Pistols. It's localised. A few more examples. A band called Screwdriver, who've got a terrible reputation because the singer, when they split up in 1978, and the singer reformed a new band called Screwdriver, who were the archetypal neo-fascist band, the most famous far-right neo-fascist, neo-Nazi band that's ever existed, actually. Ian Stewart, very horrible piece of work, but this is the first band who weren't a neo-Nazi band that he was in. They're locating themselves somewhere. Do you know where that is? Blackpool. It's not Paris. Yeah, that's Blackpool. So you say we're from Blackpool. How do we say we're from Blackpool in an image? We stand next to the Blackpool Tower. It's a fairly obvious thing to do. Gang of Four. Outside the Trains Don't Run on Time. 1979. This is actually a photograph from a book about the city of Leeds. They came from Leeds. It tells us about the municipality, it tells about the locality. It's got all sorts of other things going on, but I won't go into detail about the politics behind this. But there they are, they're projecting some image of their locality that isn't London. Resistance 77, there they are outside the local venue, sort of major concert hall in Nottingham, where they live, which has got, it says London Symphony up there, so they're saying nowhere to play, there's nowhere to play in this town, we're a bored group, we want to be able to play gigs, but there's nowhere to play, all they want to do is put classical orchestras on in the local municipal hall, and there they are photographed outside. You can see where I'm going with this. They also did a song, interestingly, on the one hand they're being very negative about their town, there's nothing to do, there's nothing to go, nowhere to play, and then they did a tribute to their local football team, Nottingham Forest, you Reds, so they're proud of their town then, so they are very much based there. Band called the Cockney Rejects, I don't know if anybody's ever heard the Cockney Rejects, they're from East London, big West Ham supporters, so one of their record sleeves, they actually did a cover version of We're Forever Blowing Bubbles, which is sung on the terraces at West Ham, and this is their sleeve in the West Ham colours. Football allegiances. So, Wessex 82, this is a group of anarcho-punk bands from the southwest of England. The White Horse, symbolising their locality. It's a local landmark down in Wiltshire. There they are, again, drawing attention to this is who we are and this is where we are. More generic, those helicopters, south coast towns, they came from the southeast of England. There's a beach scene, I'm not quite sure where that is, I must find out. Could be Thanet, somewhere around there. And this is why I'm talking about these tensions between loving a place and hating a place. This is a group called Scroties. They came from a town just outside Edinburgh called Livingston. It's a new town. Does anybody know what a new town is, or was?
Yeah, just kind of government initiative to kind of build a city or whatever from kind of nothing, really.
So post-war, post-Second World War, there was a housing shortage. There were problems because we'd been bombed out in the inner cities, particularly in London, Edinburgh not so much, Coventry, Birmingham. And there was a planning mission, like a political mission, to sort of build new towns. And there were about 16 new towns that were built in Britain. And they were built on a new design, bit like an American city. So the ones that I can think of, so we've got Livingston in Scotland. Milton Keynes is probably the most famous. If anybody's been to Milton Keynes, it's just a whole series of ring roads and not much of a town centre as such. It's a strange place. But then so is Telford, so is Preston. There's a whole series of these dotted around the country that became kind of overspill estates. They were taking the population out of congested areas or overdeveloped areas and then putting them into a new space. So the Overspill EP, this is an aerial photograph of where they live. And there's the back of the sleeve, the Scroties, with their anarchy sign in a square just for a bit of innovation. And there's some lyrics from the song. There's nothing here except for youth unemployment. This is the good life in the so-called new town. There's nothing here at all for any enjoyment. They should blow it all up or else burn it all down. So they are being really, we hate this place, isn't this a terrible place? And then they've got, thanks to all the Livy punks, so thanks to all their mates who come from that town. So on the one, we've got this tension between, we hate this place, it's terrible, but we've got this sense of community in this place, which I find really, really quite fascinating. There's another group, again, one of these DIY kind of things, Nuclear Sockets, West Norfolk's finest, music that refuses to die. And there's the back of that. So we've got thanks to all the King's Lynn kids whose enthusiasm has made this single possible. So again, they list all some of their mates' names and they're celebrating their locality and their community. The Cult Maniacs. Cult Maniacs were from Torrington in Devon, and probably the most remarkable thing about the Cult Maniacs is that their singer is now the town crier for Torrington. So he's the man that rings the bell and dresses in that ornate garb. Says "Hear ye" at the national fair. He's the singer for this band called the Cult Maniacs. This is their first EP, where they recorded a song called Black Horse. Black Horse is the name of the local pub in Torrington, and the lyrics of the song basically are about them as a group of punks wanted to go and drink in this pub. And they said, if you ever go to Torrington, don't ever go to the Black Horse, because the landlord's a Nazi. and he won't serve you because they've been thrown out. The landlord sued them, and they got taken to court, and the EP was withdrawn and melted down. Incredibly difficult to get hold of. But it's, rather than anarchy in the UK, God Save the Queen, some big international thing about international politics, here's a group of lads singing about, we hate the landlord of the local pub. We think he's a tosser because he won't serve us. That's punk to me. That's a kind of an aspect of punk that isn't celebrated, that isn't covered in these histories. And just to get into some more sort of interesting graphic sort of colloquialisms, a group called Discharge, who you may or may not know. Discharge, hardcore punk, one of the first hardcore punk bands in the UK. Particularly sort of heavy onslaught of noise, really, sort of one called Noise. Singing about nuclear war, about the Cold War, about nuclear destruction. They were really sort of quite political, very fiery, very noisy, and very fired up particularly about the Cold War and about sort of war and destruction. So this is the first Discharge single. It was released on a label called Clay Records. Clay Records comes from Stoke-on-Trent, and this is their label of the record. And it's the graphic identity of Clay. So Clay Records, any ideas why it's called Clay?
They're kilns.
Yeah. So they're kilns. You know what kilns are? If you go to Stoke-on-Trent, if you went to Stoke-on-Trent in the late 70s, some of them have gone now, but if you went to Stoke-on-Trent in the late 70s, the landscape is marked by these huge brick chimneys through the city, which are the firing kilns for the potteries. And the potteries, so Josiah Wedgwood, Spode, and I think what's come up with the third one was, there's three sort of, Minton, I think, the great pottery families of the 18th and 19th century of that area, had their own works there. They created classic pottery that you now see and auctioned on television or in collections in the V&A, etc. This kind of classic period of English pottery. So the potteries, as they're known, Stoke-on-Trent, are where these people were based, and their identity of their label is these chimneys in this pottery. That's really there's another tension there that's quite interesting for me, that we've got this kind of Josiah Wedgwood nice history of these artefacts from the 18th century that we look up to as kind of, we aspire to as these beautiful things, and this really noisy, nasty, hardcore punk that's talking about realities of war, and there's a song called Two Monstrous Nuclear Stockpiles, which is quite a title on their second EP. So there they are, sort of rallying against this war and destruction and making this horrible punk noise with this kind of quintessentially English traditional identity. That's the Clay Records label. Deptford Fun City Records, that's a photograph of the High Street in Deptford, in East London, which you may or may not recognise. Deptford Fun City, this is the first single by Squeeze, which was Jules Holland's first band. And Deptford Fun City, it's a kind of ironic comment. Deptford wasn't very much fun, and there wasn't much to do there, so Fun City is an ironic comment on Deptford. But it's a localised identity. Atrix Records in Brighton, for anybody who recognises the Brighton architectural landscape. That's a silhouette of it. Atrix Records' first release was a compilation album of local bands, and here we have Brighton Pier and the Dome and the kind of silhouette of the town of Brighton. That was their first compilation album. Second one, this is silkscreen printed in two colours. Again, it's got the silhouette at the bottom and it's printed in two different colours. And the third one, Brighton was falling into decay. Actually, the rehearsal studio where they were based, where the label was based and many of the bands were based, was burnt down, potentially but attacked by neo-Nazis, but nobody seems to know. So this is a kind of the final version, a vinyl chapter, and Brighton's been destroyed, and so this silhouette's been sort of crushed and taken apart. So, as I say, my work tended to be from a PhD about this idea about locality, how is locality reflected, and how does that sort of offer attention to these stereotypical stories that we're told about punk in London. So just to finish off from the art of punk, this is kind of beyond what I did with the PhD. This is from 2009, This is the first Saudi Arabian punk single by a group called Sounds of Ruby. So punk in Saudi Arabia, there's a nice, unusual example. Underground Kazakhstan. There's a label called Tiananmen 89 that's run by a guy called Luke, a Frenchman called Luke, who works for the United Nations, I think. He travels around the world and he collects underground recordings of punk bands around the world and releases them on his own label. So he went to Kazakhstan, he goes to Uzbekistan. So this is Underground Uzbekistan. So this is an album cover, and he collects together recordings of bands in those areas and releases them on his label. He asked them to make their own graphics. So in Uzbekistan, what do they use to symbolise their locality as their kind of archetypal punk graphics? It's combine harvesters in a field. That's the landscape of the place. Again, it's about locality, and so it's a contradiction to what we expect to see. And I think that's, oh, there we are, and there's me. A long time ago. There's me in it's about 1978, I think. Just to say, well, that's kind of where I came into this and where I came from in terms of researching this, and I'm still doing it. And it's that's there we are. That's me. Yep. And that's where I am now. We're sort of looking at locality, looking at ideas about punk that are diverse, that are different from the stereotype. Rejecting stereotypes, or questioning stereotypes, not rather than rejecting, critiquing and questioning stereotypes is really what I'm about, and that's really what I hope is the lesson for you guys in terms of the work that you do. That you can stand apart from something, you can be passionate about something, but you can stand apart and say, well, do I believe what I've been told on this? Are there other ways to explore it? My next research, the next big project that I've got on is to look at the use of humour in punk. Again, it's something that it sounds like a contradiction in terms, because punk is supposed to be angry and nasty and political, but actually a lot of it's very, very funny. A lot of it uses satire, uses models of humour to be able to persuade people, to engage people. If it was all po-faced and no fun, then people wouldn't engage with it. So it uses sort of models of humour, different models of humour, to draw people in and to engage people. And that might be very black humour, it might be very satirical humour. So that's my next project, is to do an exhibition in the book about punk and humour. But there's so many avenues to explore that it's endless. Okay, that's it.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed.